You're amazing ladies here with us today. The person you've all been looking so forward to seeing is here with us. Dr. Scott O'Moore is over here. We have guests from other chapters. I'm going to tell you Morgan Beck is here. She is an associate member of our chapter. We're thrilled to have her. She's from Great Bridge. Bobby Dribble is also here. She's an associate member, and she is from Great Bridge. Catherine Rowe is over here. She's the regent of the Chesapeake chapter. And I don't know did I see Sandy Sperry come in? I don't think I did. Okay, well, we'll look for her later. We have some applicants here today. We've got Suzanne Lane Price. There's Suzanne over there. Diane LaCroix. Where's Diane? There's Diane. Hi, Diane. Welcome. Judy Payton, where are you at? There's Judy. Hi, Judy. I've got something for you later. So and you just got to meet Claudine Moore, who's in as a transfer right now. So make sure you say hello to all of them. We have some prospective members too who are here today. We have Ramona Austin, where's Ramona? Over here. Hi, Ramona. Welcome. We have Laura Bangor, who is a guest of Jane Amelon's here today. Hi, Laura. Jennifer Bradley, are you here? Hi, Jennifer. Welcome. And Caroline Sherman. I know I saw Caroline here. There you go. You are. Welcome then. Okay, I'm sorry.
So associate here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here. Right. Okay, we've got some Hodars here today. It's a full house, right? We've got my husband, Michael Camden. Thank you. And I don't want to forget, like at the Academy Awards, I want to thank Michael for 3 years of service. I want to thank him for the 14 occasions that were the night before this meeting that he dealt with it and folded programs and listened to me rant and yell at the computer and scare the dogs. For digging up a tree at Jones and Cavacoy and for all of the other crazy things we've had him do. Thank you, Mike, for all of your help. Jeff Klein is here, Joanne Klein's husband. He's in the back. Hi, welcome. And Carlos Rivera. Hi, Carlos. Welcome. You've got some of those nice hands. And other guests, we have Nancy Hudspeth here, who is Bobby Joe's mother-in-law and a part of my family. Melissa is not here. And how about Danielle Wilson, who's a guest of Lori Sherwood, who we are going to be inducting today. All right, so let's get on to what you are all here for, and that is to hear Dr. Moore talk to us. So let me tell you. Dr. Moore is the Associate Professor and Assistant Department Chair of History at Eastern Connecticut State University. Did I get that right? Yes, okay. He is a PhD in Modern European History from the University of Maryland, College Park. His research examines nationalism and identity in Central Europe and how these societies understand their past and form a sense of community. His courses that he teaches focuses on 19th and 20th century Europe. His interests are nationalism and identity in Central Europe, historical memory and commemoration, thank goodness, right? Folklore and contemporary legend, and he likes teaching modern European history, Central European history, and folklore. He's written 2 books, along with The Witch of Congo. He's also written Teaching Empire, Education and State Loyalty in Lake Hallsberg, Austria. My goodness. He won the Board of Regents Faculty Teaching Award for Eastern Connecticut State University in 2023 and the Mentor Award for Undergraduate Research in Creative Activity. I want to thank him for being here today. He flew all the way from Connecticut to be here with us today, which is amazing. I think he loves this area as much as we do and is probably excited that we're continuing on the lore and the legacy. So without any further ado, Dr. Moore.
That great introduction. I'm sure many of you, after hearing that introduction, are asking yourselves, so how did a guy with that sort of background end up writing a book about Great Sherwood? And it's, I think, in many ways, sort of two combined things, one in my control, one not in my control. And the first is that, you know, as was just said, that I spend a lot of time thinking about historical memory. And so what I mean by that is not really what happened, but what we remember happened. In other words, how do communities think about their past? How do they think about their neighbors, the world around them? And then how do those memories forge a sense of identity and community, right? So how do you become who you are? And you can't have that focus and spend all of your time thinking about how other people have thought about who they are, and not eventually look at the world around you and think about your own experiences. So I grew up here. I went to First Colonial High School, right around the corner. Spent my undergrad at William & Mary, and so also I think I'm one of the unique people in this region whose family also grew up here. So in other words, you know, I have long-standing family ties to the Pungo area. And at some point, I probably came across the social media post about Gray Sherwood, and I was just thinking about that story and the importance to this area. And then I realized that nobody had really looked at it in depth in the sense of trying to find not just the story, but the history of that story. And so in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, this will make an interesting project that I can work on here and there in between different things. And then a small event I'm sure nobody remembers called COVID happened. And all of a sudden I couldn't go anywhere for that period. And then also my research is in Europe, and travel was irregular for about 2 years after that. And so I was homebound.
We have a little bit of trouble.
Sorry. And so all of a sudden I had to figure out what to do for my research. And I was like, well, I have this project, and I decided to work on it. I managed to find a very cooperative editor at the University of Virginia Press who immediately understood the project's appeal and encouraged me to work on it as quickly as possible. And when editors encourage you to work on things quickly, you find a way to work on things quickly. Because you don't want to, you never know when editors might leave or things like that. And so that's how this project came together. And in a certain sense, I feel like I started the project backwards from the questions I usually get, which is about what actually happened. And I think understandably, that's the question most of us want to understand. But when I started the project, I was like, well, we already know everything that happened. Everybody had to have found everything. And so I was thinking, I'll just have to summarize that. And I was going to really look at the legends and the cultural impact. And then I realized that actually people hadn't found everything yet. That there was an enormous amount of documentation that was still waiting to be uncovered. Even though, if you ever want to go look at it, it's literally sitting on an end cap in the Central Library. It's not that hard to find. And so that's what started that event. And I just want to say that I appreciate greatly being invited to speak with you this afternoon. And also for all the community support. If the book would not have happened if people had not been willing to talk with me, to share stories with me. And I know a number of you have been at events I've already given before, and I wanted to, and I've mentioned this before, but those events and those discussions helped make this book better, and so I deeply appreciate it. I would also like to thank Suzanne for inviting me here. It is always great to be home, and so I always look for excuses to get home as much as possible. And I'm also very lucky to have a very, very supportive university that is happy to send me out into the world as long as I come back. I also would like to start my final thank you by acknowledging the amazing work at the Virginia Beach Public Library. This book would not have been possible without them. If you happen to have been in the Central Library in the summers of 2021 and 2022, you might have seen me hiding in a corner somewhere. And they have an amazing research staff, especially Dorothy Williams, who, as I mentioned in the book, managed to think of questions I hadn't even thought to ask yet. And then she would come with all the material already done. And so they're an amazing resource. And if you ever happen to, I don't know, bump into a city council member or mayor, just tell them to increase the library funding. That's my point. So Today, we don't have a lot of time to dive into absolutely everything, but what I would like to do is to give you a little bit of brief insight into what I've been able to uncover about the history of Ray Sherwood, and also to walk through the process of how I pieced that research together. Because I think oftentimes it can seem a little opaque and mysterious, sort of how history gets written. And really it gets written by using documents, things that survive from the period. We'll just admire which point as I meditate on this. And so when looking at the history of Ray Sherwood, there's two unique challenges with that. The first is that, as I'm sure all of you know, this area has been talking about Ray Sherwood for centuries. And so being able to untangle what is actually based in fact and what's been part of local lore was a unique challenge. And so the bar I set for myself was if I couldn't find that piece of lore in the actual surviving documents, then that was going to be then put when I talked about the evolution of her legend, right? The auxiliary challenge is there isn't a lot that survives the colonial period from the 17th century. There was not a newspaper press in the colony of Virginia until I think around the 1720s, 1730s, and that was located in Williamsburg. So there were no newspapers. Virginians didn't really write letters at this point in time unless they happened to be exceptionally elite. And by that I mean the folks that lived in either Jamestown or Williamsburg and were around the governor and the governor's council. And then also most of the people in this story wouldn't have been able to write letters even if they wanted to because they were illiterate. So we know, for example, Ray Sherwood was illiterate. Her main accusers, Luke and Elizabeth Hill, were as well. And so there's nothing where we have her voice or the voice of her accusers. All we have are the court documents that survive. And as I always say as a tasteless joke, imagine 200-300 years from now if I'm trying to tell the story of your life and only have your IRS records and your court documents. And that's essentially all we have. And there's a lot missing, right? But we can interestingly tell a lot from those records too, if we look at them in the right lens. And so what I've also done is when I've looked at those court records, is to then look at, well, what do we know about the colonial period? What do we know about European and Virginian folk belief and folklore? And so I've been able to pepper a lot of the history and fill in those gaps with some very informed sort of speculation, but also context to help bridge what we're able to know from those broader experiences, if that makes sense. But I am the first to acknowledge that there is a lot of, I'm not exactly sure, or the best case scenario. I refer to them as the dogs that aren't barking. In other words, I have to sort of look at what's missing from the records to see what we can learn from them. And it was an interesting intellectual experience to deal with. But obviously, we have Witch Duck Point now. And if you were to go to that area, there are countless examples of Ray Sherwood's historical legacy. We know that the area known as Witch Duck has been Witch Duck at least since the early 1800s, which means that name has been tied to this area for a really long time. And so ultimately, the main thesis I make is that it's this name that actually kept Ray Sherwood alive in the community. Because, and we could go on an intellectual exercise for a second if you'd like, where imagine we have no records that survive. We only have this moment. How many years, decades, do you think we would be able to keep somebody who witnessed that event to keep those stories in the community, right? Eventually it's gonna fade away. And so all that happens is you have those stories then pass into local memory, and then it gets supplemented with interesting stories of their own. Because you probably have somebody walking by and they know that there's a witch's duck. Well, who was the witch? What happened? And so they start telling stories that may or may not be based on truth. And then by the 1830s, we find the actual surviving records. And so then we now have the history, but we also have all these stories. And that history has a lot of gaps in it. And so you squish legend and history together, and that's how you get the story as we tell it today, right? So I'm gonna spend a brief amount of time trying to give you a crash course in what we can definitively know as true. And I will also point to some interesting documents along the way. Next slide. So here you have a map that was created by one of my students. I don't know how he did it because I don't understand technology. I do know that he was able to take essentially a contemporaneous coastline of the region. Unfortunately, we don't have the precise tidal charts and evolution, so it's very difficult to approximate coastline. But the political boundaries and things like other things like that, we can do really, really well. And so this shows you the county. The reason I like to start with this map is because if you were to look at the relief that's up at the top, that gives you the approximate location of the courthouse and the church at the time of Grace Sherwood. And these were among the only two actual buildings official for the county at that time. If you look at the very bottom of the map, you'll see a little house next to a little bit above Back Bay, and that's the best approximation for where we know Grace Sherwood was. And the reason I like to use this map is it shows you how isolated her community was from the bulk of where people lived in Princess Anne County. And so she was known primarily by reputation once you leave that immediate area around Back Bay. And this is a time where it was very difficult to travel. Most Virginians didn't leave around 4 to 5 miles from where they lived, except in extreme circumstances like having to go to court. And so most people spent their lives around the same 24 or so people. And so this was a very close-knit community where reputation mattered enormously. Was a small landowner. She and her husband James inherited all of that property from her father, who died in 1681. Her father was a carpenter and a Midland landowner who owned around 200 acres of land, technically around 195. And what's interesting with the Sherwoods is that James Sherwood did not have his father-in-law's training or property. Everything they had was inherited from the father-in-law. And what this means is, given the tenor of the time, the couple was very vulnerable to have their social reputation slide. Because first off, I am not besmirching the character of James Sherwood, but from a crass socioeconomic perspective, which mattered a lot in marriage during this period, Grace Sherwood married down. If you were to compare where she was as the daughter of a carpenter and landowner and who she married. And what that means is she's now tied to her husband's reputation. Next slide, please. We know once James Sherwood died and his assets were itemized for an inventory, that the couple was experiencing financial issues. If you were to look at this document, which survives, you'll notice a reoccurring word, which is old. What that means is, if you put that in the context for what we know about wills from this period, this means almost all of that was inherited from her father. So that means the couple hadn't bought anything substantial in probably about a decade or two. I also always think it's a personal slander against the poor, scabby, mangy horse. I felt like that's an unnecessary amount of editorializing on behalf of the surveyor. We also know that the couple was experiencing economic problems because her husband was sued several times for not paying debts. This was not uncommon. Virginians borrowed money all the time from everybody, and one of the most common things people sued for was not being paid back. But what's interesting with James Sherwood is he's never lending money. He's only ever borrowing. He also has to sell some land around this time, and they never buy new land. And so all of that is showing somebody who is in financial trouble. And we know that that impacts reputation. Around the time this happens, Grace Sherwood begins a series of slander suits, which are the second most common type of court cases during this period. If you were to look at the standard court day, they are almost always people who have not repaid debts, and then slander suits. And that's because people jealously guarded their reputations. I would like to also take a moment to acknowledge that this is one of my favorite pictures because it is so anachronistic. But this was collected by Edgar Brown, who collected enormous amounts of local history in the 1990s. And this was used for an A&E special that featured Grace Sherwood and was collected by Brown. And I'm guessing this is both to show her as beautiful as local folklore says, and also that she wore pants. But if you were to look, she looks more like a 19th century gentlewoman in riding attire, not a poor farmer's wife from the 17th century. But I love this picture in so many ways. So we know, for example, that she began suing neighbors in March of 1698. The first was Richard Capps, who was one of her immediate neighbors. He was also a constable, so he was in charge for enforcing sheriff orders in the area. The Sherwoods like to sue up. They always are targeting people who are very influential in the county, which I think is bold of them. We have no idea what prompted this suit. All we know is that Richard Capps was sued for defaming her character. The assumption is because of the other suits that this is about witchcraft, but we have no way of knowing. And in fact, since they don't mention what she's being, or what he's being sued for, my suspicion is that it was over an allegation of sexual impropriety. If you were to look at the work that historians have done analyzing court records, when women sued, I think maybe 70–80% of the time it was over allegations of sexual impropriety. The rest were mainly allegations of witchcraft. And so those were the two general. And the fact that they didn't feel compelled to explain why may have been self-evident, if you're thinking of the county clerk who knows these things.